Welcome to the Adoptee Thoughts Podcast. I am your host, Melissa Guida-Richards, an author, adoptee, and mom. Each week, we will delve into the nuances of adoption, as well as tips for how to bring up difficult discussions in your adoptive family. And most importantly, we will not shy away from tough topics. So thanks for joining me today, and let's jump into your weekly dose of Adoptee Thoughts. What is your name?
My name is Jessica Luciere.
And can you share a little bit about your adoption story with me?
Absolutely. I was adopted from Colombia when I was about 3 months old to a family here on Long Island in New York, and I grew up here for my whole life. I grew up in if anyone knows anything about Levittown, people are learning about Levittown these days, but it's an exclusively white neighborhood. And being a person of color, it was definitely something that I experienced more attention on as I got older. But as a kid, growing up in this town, I had my friends and I had my peers and didn't necessarily feel like I was any different than anyone else. And luckily, I wasn't really treated like I was anyone, who didn't fit in or my skin color was an issue. And I grew up here until I was in college. And then I went to college and, had my different cultural experiences where I then joined an organization, the Student Organization of Latinos, at the college that I was attending. And it was the first time that I had ever been a part of a group that was, people that looked like me and that shared that same culture. But when I went into the room, I felt, I don't want to use the word inadequate, but definitely as though I didn't necessarily belong. And it was the first time I had ever felt like that. It was also the first time I had ever been in a room with so many people who looked like me, skin color, hair color. And it was a big adjustment for me to exist in that space. But to make a very long story short with that experience, that was the first experience that I had with my awareness of my culture. And it inspired me to learn a lot more about my culture. And I embraced that uncomfortability that I had in being in that room and made it a very positive experience. I had to kind of be an advocate for adoption at a very young age. And that catapulted me into the work that I've been doing, for the rest of my adult life, more or less. And I had always support from my parents, and I always felt very comfortable talking to them and sharing my thoughts and my questions that I would have along the way of my life. And as I got older, they had always said that they would be supportive if I had ever had interest in searching for my biological family. And even if I didn't, whatever I wanted to do, they would support me in my decisions. And having that peace of mind and having that sense of security at home with my parents as an only child was huge, because it really allowed for me to be who I was going to be and feel comfortable in my own skin and feel comfortable making the decisions that I felt were right with me, for me. And I eventually ended up doing some work with other Colombian adoptees kind of by accident. We had found each other. We were meeting in groups here in New York. It was about 3 or 4 of us. We brought this group online. It started becoming a bigger thing, and we had people who were connected to Colombian adoption all around the world join our group. And through that, I found a private investigator, and several years later contacted him after a few friends of mine in the Colombian adoptee world had gone through him and was successful with a search.
Wow.
So I went down about a year later after finding them, and after finding my birth mother, I should say, and had the opportunity to reunite with them. And it was really an incredible experience. And somehow that's almost 16 years ago already. So I went from being an only child growing up here in New York to being one of 5 kids.
Wow. Yeah. I actually just found my birth mother back in March.
Wow.
So it's kind of cool hearing other adoptees who have found that. I haven't had a chance to go down there yet. but we're thinking about it once the pandemic is over.
Yeah.
Do you remember how you felt when you received that call that they found her?
It was actually, it wasn't a call, it was an email. And this was back in the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
And I was expecting to hear back from this gentleman maybe a month, 2 months down the line. I heard back from him in about a week.
Wow.
With not just, I found your birth mother, but here's your birth mother, and here's literal pages of just your story. Your brother, you have an older brother, you have 4 younger siblings. She's remarried. There's a whole other family, that's
Mm-hmm.
and that also that did not know about you.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a reality of that there, that there's a layer that you're not really expecting yourself to kind of encounter. You're not thinking about that. You're almost just thinking about how big the moment is, and just the simple act of reuniting and finding, searching. And then you come to the reality that, oh wait, nobody may know about me. And what does that bring to you as the adoptee? What does that bring to your family, your birth family? How does that bond them, or how does that divide them? And luckily, in my case, it bonded them, because when I eventually went down there a year later, it was as though everyone in that room was biologically connected to me, when only half of the people were. My birth mother's husband's family was there. There might have been more of them there than there were of my own mother's family. And
Wow.
to have that acceptance and that embrace, there was no like, oh, this is my husband's sister, this was tu tia, this is your cut, tu primo, there was no divide, there was no otherness.
Yeah. That sounds amazing. I'm so glad that you had a great experience with
I am
that.
too.
I know that there's a lot more to different stories, and everything isn't as great as that was.
Right.
So it's so, I don't know, peaceful to hear an adoptee find and assimilate to their birth family with such warm, open arms. How did your adoptive family react when you told them that you found your birth family?
My parents were really wonderful it's never the right time, right, to do these kinds of searches. There's no such thing as the right time in many different things that we experience in life. This is something that adoptees spend a lot of their lives thinking about, or pushing to the corner, or trying not to think about. It's just a reality in our narratives. And I was in college, and I was busy, and I was an art student, and I had a lot on my plate. I had this cultural awakening that I was in the middle of, and but when this opportunity, arose, I brought it to my parents, and I said, listen, what do you think about this? Do you think I should try this, going down this road of this private investigator? And they were like, if this is what you want to do, then let's do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was at a very tricky time in my life. My father had just had a brain hemorrhage, and my mother had just been diagnosed with colon cancer. And so it was really not the right time.
Yeah.
But they said, let's do this. If this is what you want to do, let's see what it looks like. And when I opened up my email that day and saw a week later just of this like avalanche of information, I don't think I was hesitant to bring my parents into that conversation. I think I called them before I even opened the email, and had them come, because I was still living at home, come upstairs and just share in this excitement with me, and try to decipher what this all completely in Spanish email was saying. And I couldn't, and they were excited to see me excited. And they were very supportive. And they had said, despite what they had been going through personally and health-wise, we'll go down there with you if you want us to.
That's so nice.
Yeah. My parents were very incredible people. They've unfortunately both passed, but they were as wonderful as they possibly could be, as supportive as parents could be, and as mindful of my experience being my experience, and them being able to share in that as they could be. It's very lucky.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that, but I'm glad that they were very amazing. They sounds like they were the ideal adoptive parents.
They do sound like that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
In ways they were, in ways,
Yeah, no one's perfect, of
right.
course.
Exactly.
Were you able to talk to them about race growing up? Did they bring up those types of conversations with you?
No. Looking back and seeing how conversations are happening these days and the importance of having these kinds of conversations about race and racism, and those two topics as being two separate topics, I don't think we did have those conversations. We lived in a very white neighborhood, and when I speak on panels to adoptive parents or pre-adoptive parents, birth parents, or even adoptees, a lot of my childhood was just spent having fun with my friends and having a very innocent experience of childhood. And I'm thankful that I didn't really experience any kind of racism or otherness from my peers or from my teachers. And maybe people did, it's in these times now that I'm looking back and I'm wondering, did people look at me and see the color of my skin before they saw me? Because I didn't live my life like that. And I wonder what conversations about race would have been like, especially in this particular neighborhood, especially back in the 80s when adoption wasn't really spoken about. There was no question that I was adopted because I didn't look anything like my parents. My parents are Italian and Irish. But we did not have conversations like that. And I don't know if it's just because my parents didn't know how to talk about it. There weren't enough resources of how to talk to your transracial child about, race and racism in the 80s. But I also don't know what that kind of conversation would have looked like with them and how comfortable that would have been if I wasn't kind of out there feeling like it was an important topic. If it was today, then it would be a different conversation. I do think it's important for parents to absolutely talk about this with their kids and have an open dialogue. But because I can't imagine what it would have been like for me.
Did you feel comfortable when you started to integrate into a bigger Latino population in college when you went to those meetings? Or did you ever experience any otherness because you were adopted? Because I had a similar club that I tried to join, but it was a little too much for me. I'm actually a late discovery adoptee, so I found out maybe a year before I started joining clubs. Everything, I was 19, 20, and it was just super awkward for me when people would come up to me and talk to me in Spanish. And then I would always kind of have to face with, do I tell them I'm adopted, or do I just say, oh yeah, I grew up here but was born in Bogota or whatever.
Yeah.
Did you have anything like that?
Oh, of course I did. Of course, because the second I'm going to say, I say you, I mean me.
Yeah.
The second I opened my mouth, they were like, you sound like a white girl. You're not, do you speak Spanish? No, I don't speak Spanish. I spoke bad high school Spanish. And there was the first time in my life when I had to stand up for myself and stand up for my position of being a person of color with no cultural references. Like I had no experience of surviving in the skin that I had, having the responsibilities that other people who look like me have. And what I used to say when I would speak to parents was that I felt like I was false advertising. You would look at me and you would assume something. People would come up to me, they would speak Spanish to me, and I couldn't, return the conversation.
Yeah.
And I found in that discomfort in college that I had to take that and use that as a moment to educate. And I don't think it's adoptees, I don't think it's their responsibility to be continuously educating everyone out there about adoptees, because we're allowed to have our own stories and we don't always have to be advocating
Mm-hmm.
for why we are adopted or what our story may be.
Yeah.
But I looked at that in the moment of people kind of, calling me a coconut and giving me a hard time. You're not really Colombian. What do you know about Colombia?
Mm-hmm.
I stuck with that group through my college years and became a part of their executive board and made sure that along the way, anyone who had something to say was understood why everything they thought they knew about me, they didn't know about me, and it was a bigger conversation about just acceptance of me as one person, but acceptance of the understanding of adoption as, they move throughout life. You're going to meet people like me.
Yeah.
I'd rather you have an understanding now when you're in your formative years in college than, thinking that it's okay to call people out
Mm-hmm.
for not having the cultural reference of their, the skin that they're in.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from, and I'm glad you were able to stick through it. Can you tell me a little bit more about your work with adoptees?
Sure. So when that group that I had mentioned before of the Colombian adoptees who had formed, this kind of this accidental online group a long time ago in Yahoo groups,
Mm-hmm.
it was through that I was contacted by a social worker and was asked to come and speak on a panel. And I was still very, new to my own awakening of my adoption identity. I don't really like to say that, but who I wasn't as adoptee, I should say.
Yeah.
And I went in and spoke to, pre-adoptive parents, some people who were in placement and some people who had adopted already, and shared my story. And I felt so like I was in ownership of myself once I heard myself tell my story. It was the first time I had actually heard myself actually speak my story out loud
Mm-hmm.
as a story for other people to take in as like it would be useful.
Yeah.
Other than standing up for myself in college. And this was while I was in college. And through that connection and through that relationship with speaking on panels with this agency, with this organization, there was a mentorship program that had been developed by a good friend of mine. She became a very good friend and mentored me. She developed a mentorship program for younger adoptees to connect with older adoptees, both internationally and domestically adopted,
Mm-hmm.
because there was interest from younger kids who wanted to get to know other adoptees, who wanted
Yeah.
to get to know older adoptees. So we formed that mentorship program because of them. They wanted it. It wasn't something that we're like, let's do this and
Mm-hmm.
see what it looks like. They were like, let's do this because we want this.
Yeah.
And there's no better reason to do anything than when somebody's asking for it.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was about 16 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I stuck around with this program for the entirety of it. And I'm still the only mentor who's been there since the beginning. And I now oversee the program. And along the way, it has been the most constant thing I've done in my adult life. And along the way with doing mentoring, I was also continually speaking on panels, speaking at conferences, and just expanding my own network. And so now, like I said, I oversee this program, and I'm also the president of a Brooklyn-based mentorship program that serves adoptive families and kids in a group mentoring fashion also. So it's the most rewarding work that I could do. It's the most personal work that I can do. It's difficult to get through work sometimes just because there's no way to detach yourself from doing work and your own personal story and narrative, because my whole life and my identity as an adoptee is continually changing the more and more I work with other adoptees, and especially with younger adoptees,
Mm-hmm.
understanding what they go through today and discussing very difficult topics that I wish that I had an outlet for when I was their age.
Did you know any other adoptees when you were growing up?
I did. My parents adopted me through an organization called LAPA, the American Parents Association. And through that, when they had gone down to Colombia in the early 80s, they had gone down there with another group of families who were adopting, and they were all local to where we lived.
Oh, okay.
So I had one particular adoptee that I was very close with. I mean, we're like moments, literally minutes apart. We were born minutes apart. We were in the same orphanage together. And so I always had somebody, but I can't say that growing up I was ever very interested in my adoption story. I was just, I was glad to have her and glad to have the other kids that I was adopted with, but we did not necessarily grow together in our adoption, our lives as adoptees as we grew up. I don't even speak to like 90% of them anymore.
Yeah.
But I can say that it was in those formative years of like between 11 to 18 when you start having more questions about your identity and start reflecting in more.
Mm-hmm.
And that is exactly the age group of the kids in my program. And so I think of the benefits that I would have, how beneficial it would have been for me to be able to have some of these deep conversations at their age, and I'm glad to be able to have them now at my age with them, in those years.
What's the most beneficial part about it that you think the program is? Like, if you were a kid, which part would be most essential for you to process things?
I think the most powerful moment for our kids and for our mentors is the moment when we're all in a room together, when we could be in a room together. um, and you realize that everyone in that room is adopted. You have that instant camaraderie. You have families that are coming in and dropping their kids off, and there's no one in that room looking at you as a child thinking, oh, I wonder, they don't look like their mom or they don't look like their dad. There's none of that. And in these
Yeah.
years, especially dealing with kids that are growing up in the tri-state area, New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, there's such, there's a lot of diversity,
Mm-hmm.
but these kids are becoming much more aware of their physical appearances and people's assumptions of who they are, and they have to
Yeah.
start kind of building up their own narrative as to, how do I explain this? Do I explain this, why I don't look like my parents? When you walk into a
Mm-hmm.
room, when no one is wondering that, everyone has a similar narrative, more or less. Nobody essentially looks like their parents. I mean, we have some people who look like their parents just by happenstance, but
Mm-hmm.
that in itself, I think, sets the tone for us to have a really successful program with our kids, because they understand. There's an instant acceptance,
Yeah.
hearing each other's stories and connecting and leaving a space, a very open space, with nothing but respect for each other's stories, and understanding that we all have different stories. We all have, very different backgrounds, maybe different beliefs on our adoption and what that means to us. When kids get to hear other people talk about their experiences as adoptees, they start hearing things that they're feeling or that they've felt mirrored back to them that they may have never
Mm-hmm.
spoken out loud. Because for some people that join mentorship programs, when it's like an adoption based mentorship program, they've maybe never ever met another adoptee. They don't have somebody
Mm-hmm.
in their close peer circle. They don't feel as comfortable talking to their parents about these things. And the second then they're in this room and they're able to kind of let their guard down and at least
Yeah.
just listen, not always share. There's no expectation for anyone to share anything. We just want you to be open minded and listen to each other. There's a lot of power in that moment. There's a lot of power in that experience.
Yeah. Just listening to that, I'm like, how do I get involved with something like that? I met my first fellow adoptee in person last year. She just happened to be part of my mom group that I was part of, and then by word of mouth, we heard about each other, and then we met for coffee, and that was my first experience sitting down with someone who was a transracial adoptee like me. who had a similar type of experience with her adoptive parents, and then just being able to talk to somebody who understood. I came home talking to my husband a mile a minute. I was like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
You have no idea what it's like. And it's just like a really nice experience, because even hanging out with other Latinos and other Colombians, like my husband's half Colombian, so like I have that type of aspect, but then I don't know, I feel a little bit jealous sometimes because he got to grow up with a Colombian mom. Like he understands like a lot of the food and most of the language and all that stuff, but with other adoptees, they really get it, like you said.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Is that group still taking on people even with the pandemic? Because like I'm sure people are going to listen to this and be like, how can I get my kids involved in that?
Oh no, absolutely. And you know, if there's anything that we can say that's good that has come out of this is, you know, you and I are having this conversation, right? People are being able to connect with connecting. I have been able to connect with families all around the world in virtual platforms. And so we're able to essentially open up our programming to people outside of this immediate area. Normally, these events are held in person for the last few months of this, you know, school year. Of course, we had to use a digital platform, and for the beginning of next year, we will be using a digital platform. But this allows for us to widen and expand our horizons as far as how many people we can reach, because it's important work. I think mentorship, my own thoughts are mentorship is more important now than ever. You know, it's important to have a version of yourself reflected back at you so that you can, you know, you have some sort of a guide to help you grow. Just having, you know, people there that can echo your feelings, that can say, I've been there, I felt that, I understand what you're going through, I understand how difficult or how hard this, or, you know, whatever it may be is. Everybody needs that. Programs like this are important because we are able to reach kids and reach, you know, the younger versions of ourselves, essentially. But we, as older, you know, adult adoptees, get just as much out of this program, as much as you know, out of these programs, because we didn't always have, you know, not all of us had something like this as we were younger. You know, and the opportunity to be a mentor, quote unquote, is a very powerful and important responsibility. And because of that, you know, I can only see this kind of platform expanding because of, you know, because of the connectivity, you know, the connectivity that we now have.
Yeah, and I constantly get like messages from adoptive parents looking for ways to help their adoptees. So if you can just send me a link or wherever
Sure.
that people can reach you and apply, or whatever the process is.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Do you also I think I heard you mention talking about helping adoptive parents as well. Was that something that you do?
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about how that works?
Well, my first introduction to kind of sharing my story publicly was really more with parents than it was with my fellow adoptees. And I really enjoy talking to adoptive parents. Like I said, I've spoken on panels where I've shared my story. I've talked specifically about different aspects of my life. You know, I've spoken to parents specifically about talking about adoption. When do you talk about adoption? How do you talk about adoption with your children as little kids? Spoken to them about search and reunion. I've talked to them about the importance of mentorship and you know, community programming for adoptees and adoptive families. The work is important with adoptees. It's also important with adoptive families because adoptive families need support. All families need support, right? Parenting is tough. Parenting is a difficult thing. And what I like to kind of always remind, especially adoptive parents, is that, you know, where they may think that certain things might be more singularly different because they are an adoptive family and maybe transracial. every family struggles. Every family struggles to grow together in different ways. And those struggles don't always have to be hard. They can be beautiful. They can be tough. They can be long. They can be,
Yeah.
So when I get to speak with parents, we're developing right now in my Manhattan-based program, a program to go alongside the kids program, because we always engage the parents. But we want to make sure that they have support.
Mm-hmm.
We want to make sure that they are speaking, that they have the chance to speak to us as mentors, to hear from other adoptees, to hear different stories, to talk about race and racism. How we bring these conversations home?
Mm-hmm.
How do we talk about sex and sexuality and how that affects adoptees, and how to talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, culture. What is culture?
Yeah.
So being able to bring some of those conversations to adoptive parents, I think, helps to strengthen the bonds that they then bring home to their families. They can be advocates, essentially, for their children, for their stance on adoption, because it's not only us as adoptees that have to be the advocates. We need our friends, we need our families to advocate for us also.
Mm-hmm.
And the better we can help each other, the better, the more we can share each other's stories, and we can help, give each other the resources that will better help everybody understand how to move into the world, supporting our community, the better.
Yeah, exactly.
And adoptive parents love to hear from adoptees, especially adoptees that are not so far much older than their kids are.
Mm-hmm.
Because essentially we are just, in some way, an older representation from their own children. And sometimes they need to hear it's going to be okay. Sometimes they need to hear, your kids don't hate you. They're not, all kids hate their parents
Yeah.
when they're teenagers.
Yeah.
Not all kids want to search. Not all kids are interested in finding biological information out. Not everyone is going to run to the computer and try to find their families on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
These kinds of things, I think, help to ease parents' fears, because they start to feel all of these emotions almost all at once, with the unknown of what my adopted child may be interested in, and how can I support them? How much bandwidth do I have for that? And what are my resources that I can offer them
Mm-hmm.
to make them feel fully supported?
What's the most common question that you get from adoptive parents?
That's a good question. I think the most prevalent question that I get is about search and reunion.
Mm.
Do all adoptees want to search? What happens if it's not possible for my kid? And then that kind of spirals into, should I search for them?
Mm.
And that also turns into, at what age do you think we should start looking? It's always about search and reunion, because I think that there is this just pure and understandable fear that they could have a child who, knows that they have a family out there somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
understands that there are people who they are biologically connected to. And for most kids, if not all kids who are adopted, I think usually our first relationship with adoption and our questions starts in the mirror.
Yeah.
Who do I look like? I don't have anyone that I look like. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if I look like my birth mother. I wonder if I have siblings. So I think for parents, there's this real fear that once their child decides to search, if they find this biological connection and there's just this true, like, innate connection, are they going to want to leave? Like, is that their new family?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that they know that we love them? And I said,
Mm-hmm.
be amazing parents, support them. Love your kid just like you would love your child if they were biologically connected to you, and support them, and understand that it's an understandable fear to wonder if your child has, um, dreams of being with their biological family, but also understand that a lot of kids don't. they have the same kinds of questions that biological children may have for their parents. Oh, I wonder who I look like. Oh, but we can't answer our questions.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
starts an internal reflection a lot earlier than maybe some other kids who are not adopted.
Yeah. And I think that's something that adoptive parents need to take a look at before they even consider adopting. Because when I talked to my mom about why she did an international adoption versus domestic adoption, one of the first things she told me was that she would always be afraid that birth parents would come and try to take me back if she did a domestic adoption. So that's why she did an international one. And I know that a lot of people don't like to say that, but I've heard quite a few adoptive parents admit to similar lines of thinking. And I understand. Like, I would be afraid too, I think, if I was an adoptive parent. But as an adoptee and knowing how I feel about my adoptive parents and my love for them, I would never just up and pack my bags and go. I like to look at it like you have a mother and father or whatever type of parent structure, and then the parents get divorced and remarried, and then you have step parents coming in. It's just a child can love many people, and a child can have more than one family and more than one parent. That doesn't detract from their love for you. So that's kind of the way I look at it.
Right. But that's your voice as an adoptee, kind of like lending that calm and that perspective to adoptive parents, because you almost you can kind of almost hear the fear. And I'm just using your story as an example. You can almost hear the fear in your mother's voice and saying, I didn't want somebody to come and get you. So if that's the fear, and as kind of unthinkable as that actually is, as a person who is adopted, and us, especially international adoptees, that's not a possibility, really. But you can see how these other thoughts and these other fears can really accumulate and turn into real fears that could eventually prevent conversations, could prevent openness in a family. Because what happens if we bring this up? What happens if we put that idea in their head that there's somebody else out there that we share information? There's no right or wrong way to do it. The only thing is, just love your kids and just raise them to be good people and set a good example for them, and just be supportive, and to understand that adoptees, just like non-adoptees, have very unique experiences and very unique stories and different perspectives and different wants and needs as they grow up.
Yeah. Every story is different. And have you ever heard an adoptive parent refer to their adoptee as ungrateful? Because I get one of the top searches on my blog is ungrateful adopted child. That gets me the most hits.
Absolutely.
How do you handle that?
There have been times that I have been kind of handed over children that were thought to be ungrateful, to talk to them and to kind of get perspective. And they're not ungrateful. There's a lot of kids out there that just do not know how to verbalize their feelings. They don't know how to bring some of these conversations home. And what I like to tell parents is, you are our first line of defense. If we feel safe with you, then we can go out there and feel confident in ourselves, in the world, in the ground that we stand on, because we know that mom and dad support us. And just as much as you support us and you stand in front of us and you kind of shield us from the world, adoptees shield you from the world. They shield you from their world. Because where I'm telling you that I had a very pleasant upbringing, I definitely did have moments when I was growing up that I did feel different. And I could not bring that to my parents to share that with them. I look different than you. Oh, you look Sicilian. You look like me. My dad used to say all the time. And it was endearing and it was cute to me at the time. And it still is, because he's not here. And I can think back on that with a smile. But because kids don't always know how to say what they're feeling as it comes to their adoption and how they may be feeling internally, if it may be that they have more questions about where they come from, having dreams about their biological family, what it may mean to meet their families, or to reunite with their birth mother, that mixed in with adolescence can easily turn into something where the parents may feel like they're not connecting with their kids, or they feel ungrateful. And it's not that. It's just that they are growing and they are trying to figure out a way for them to answer questions that they may never have answers for internally without bringing the conversation home and essentially almost, potentially hurting their parents. These questions can hurt parents. I remember being maybe 13 years old on my birthday. My birthday is May 9th, and that is always right around Mother's Day. And I remember we had gone to get ice cream, and I was crying in the car because I had so many emotions, because it was the first time that I had really thought to myself, I wonder if there's a Mother's Day in Colombia. I wonder if it's this weekend. And I wonder if it fell on my birthday when my mother had me. And I remember sitting in the back of the car so vividly. And I just started crying because it was like you were so overwhelmed and you didn't have anywhere to say all of this, because I was in the car with my parents. And I remember just like through my tears, I said, do you think my birth mother thinks about me, or she remembers when my birthday is? And my parents immediately said, of course. I'm sure she did. But everything else that I had been trying to work through in myself, I couldn't bring to say, because it was such an overwhelming feeling, of loss and the unknown, that right there is what I say to parents is there's so much I could have said. I said nothing, because I knew that if I had said anything more and said, I'm thinking about her, or I wonder if she looks like me, or if I wonder if it was Mother's Day when she had to give me up for adoption, can really hurt my parents. And I wanted to protect them. So adoptees really do protect their parents. And a lot of times that can be misconstrued as ungratefulness or a reluctancy to be open, or why doesn't my kid want to talk to me about adoption? I'm so open-minded. I'm so ready to have these conversations, because they're building their narrative.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. And one of the things that I hear a lot also is that adoptive parents, or just people who know adoptees, will say, oh, well, I know an adoptee and they're perfectly fine with their adoption. They have never had any issues or anything. They're happy. They're well adjusted. Like, why are you like that to strangers on the internet, And like you said, adoptees aren't going to share every nuanced emotion that they have with everybody in their lives. And like, I don't like hurting my mom when I talk about it, or my dad, but I think one of the best things an adoptive parent can do is seek counseling for themselves and realize that an adoptee expressing their feelings or questions or anything about adoption isn't a personal attack on them, and that they can feel upset, that they have every right to be upset when an adoptee talks openly, and it can hurt you, because we're all human. But it's not the adoptee's responsibility to be the adult in that situation. And if you're adopting a child, it's your responsibility to support them, even when some of those feelings are hard for you to hear.
That's the wonderful thing about the adoption community, I think, these days, and my view of the evolution of it, as far as education goes for parents, long before they're actually even adopting. There are more conversations about culture, bringing culture into your house, creating a community for yourself, seeking counseling. Parenting is a journey for anybody, adoptive, non-adoptive. To have support is important, and to understand to have it. There are a lot of adoption experts out there. They'll call themselves adoption experts. And they're not, because if you're not adopted, then you're not an adoption expert.
Yep.
And, I always encourage parents to understand that every adoptee has a different story, but listen to all of the stories you can hear and understand from before you even have your child that just like any non-adopted person, you're going to have your own unique experience. And just because somebody may seem well adjusted and may seem like they're okay, quote unquote, with their adoption story, that could very well just be what they want you to see. Just like anything else in life, we have ways of handling ourselves and presenting ourselves so that people see what we want them to see. And, being an adoptee who shares their story very often and have had people who've seen my evolution of my story, I think can understand that we change as people.
Yes.
And you have to be aware and be ready for that acceptance, but be active in this community, be a part of this community, be an advocate for this community, because the more you show that you're an ally and that you're here for not just your child, the better educated you are, and you can see that people have different experiences, and you can better ready yourself for anything that may come.
Exactly. And I think that means for adoptive parents especially to elevate voices even if you don't necessarily agree with them, with
Absolutely.
especially from adult adoptees. And that's my favorite part of your program, is that you integrate such an important part of the adoption community, because like you said, we have lived through it, and birth mothers and adoptive parents, they can empathize as much as they want, and they can be the most open-minded person, but at the end of the day, they're not in our shoes. They don't know what it feels like. Sure. So I really love that you do that. Do you have any advice for prospective adoptive parents that are listening right now?
I think the most important thing anybody can do is create a community for themselves. Involve yourselves in conversations about adoption, hear from adoptees, be open-minded, and listen to as many stories as you can. And understand also that just because there may be adoptees who are out there who are willing to share their stories, we're not obligated to share them just because we're adoptees. I think there's a lot of us out there that feel like our stories can be helpful, and that even telling our stories is therapeutic for us. There's obviously seek out as many different stories from adoptees, from adoptive families as you possibly can, and start working on yourselves. Start working on the idea of bringing somebody in who can become a complex human being.
Yeah.
And what does that look like for you? Are you ready to take on every different question and challenge that may come, not just with them being an adoptee, but just as a child growing? And, understand that culture is also an important part of a household, especially when you have a transracial home. The acknowledgement of culture and otherness, and talking about difficult topics, and understanding that uncomfortability exists in the home. And if you can't have uncomfortable conversations at home, you're not going to have an easy time having them outside of your home. So, embrace the discomfort that comes with building a family, and understanding, different opinions from different people who may live with you.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned culture a bunch of times. I remember that you said that growing up, you grew up in a prominently white town. Your parents were white. Do you wish that that's something that you could have changed about your childhood, having more of the culture integrated as you grew up?
No, I really didn't. I don't think I was interested. We didn't live, in the times that we are now, and, having the internet.
Yeah.
Having the internet and having there be reflections of yourself kind of shown back to you at a very young age, I would have definitely said I would have noticed differences at a younger age. I would have been more interested in understanding the language, the culture, the food, everything that comes along with being Colombian. But I really wasn't interested. I was interested in making friends and having fun and being a kid. That was what was the most important part of my existence in this town. And now, as an adult, and even in my college years, when I came into that organization and started learning about my culture and immersed myself in Latin American studies, and really found a lot of enjoyment in being able to bring home what I had learned to my parents and infusing my household with culture at that point, being able to bring home food, bring home all new friends, bringing home music, and dancing in the backyard, like having an adult experience of embracing a culture, and then having your adult, your parents as people who now view you as not necessarily a child anymore, and having that be a level playing field. It was such an incredible experience for me. And I'm so thankful that my parents were so welcoming to this awakening that I had, and they got to eat some really good food because of it. And my friends that I met back then are the friends that I have today, and they have integrated with the friends that I grew up with. And, we got this huge kind of like melting pot happening in the middle of Levittown, which that's not a common thing.
I know you said you wouldn't change anything because growing up back then, things were different. Now that all the teens are on TikTok and Instagram, and you can see pictures of other people's families and food that they're eating and stuff. Do you think it's more important now for adoptive parents to integrate culture?
Absolutely. Because they don't have any excuse to not have the resources to do it. My parents might have gone down to Colombia and to get me and get some artifacts, get some memories, some tangible memories for me to have. Different pieces of gold. I have some emeralds. I have cold play. I mean, but that was as much as they could do. And then growing up, we were not traveling down to Colombia in the 80s. You know what I mean? Like, they weren't going to bring me down there. Not because we had a conversation and they said it's not happening. It's just because it wasn't on the list of places that we wanted to go as a family. And I understand as an adult now the importance of integrating culture into a family, because I can say to you that I don't think that I missed out on that. But I can tell you that in my later years as a teenager, seeing that there were definite cultural differences between me and my parents, I did not know how to acknowledge them. I knew how to be prideful. I was always prideful of being from Colombia. My parents always made me prideful of that. But I didn't have any more than just that. That was all I had, was pride. Now, talking to parents about integrating culture into the conversation from the very start, buy some books, have somebody that's going to speak Spanish around your child, learn Spanish yourself. So it's not like I have to find a Spanish speaking person to integrate into my life. Learn these things, because the more you're opening yourself up culturally to your child, the better connected you're going to have to them when they have that cultural awakening and they feel super alone. Because I felt very alone. I couldn't bring that conversation home to my parents after that literally, it was in my first week of college. My first week of college was also was 9/11.
Wow.
And so you're dealing with the weight of the world and how affected you are from what has happened.
Yeah.
And then I had also, right before that happened, had this experience in college with meeting this group of people. And everyone was looking around for answers and for finding where they were and what things meant. And it was too heavy of a conversation to bring home. So what I had to do was just kind of forge ahead into those conversations of defending myself. And it was probably in those moments that I wished that I had some more support, cultural support at home that my parents had kind of ready for me. But now, absolutely, I tell parents all the time, buy some books, make sure you're bringing your kids to areas where they see themselves reflected back, and talk about the differences, talk about race, talk about racism, talk about cultural differences, and make them conversations that are appropriate for the age of the child. And that way you can grow with them. You grow into these uncomfortable conversations in a comfortable way because you're steering the ship.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on tonight and talking with us. I really enjoyed having you on and learning a bunch of new things. I hope you had a good time as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melissa. I really do appreciate the opportunity, and it's really amazing what you're doing.
I'm so glad that you joined me today. And if you would like to hear more from Adoptee Thoughts, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you'd like to learn more about me, you can check out my website, adopteethoughts.com. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.